Let's talk about how to write an A-level thesis for your first rhetorical analysis essay. Now, because you're doing a rhetorical analysis of an image rather than a text for this assignment, some students feel kind of confused about the thesis statement because they might not be used to analyzing images. They're used to analyzing short stories or essays or texts. So I want to show you some examples of thesis statements that are passing. Some of these are in the B+ range, some of them are A's written by professionals, and also some examples of thesis statements that are non-passing and why they would not earn a passing score. Some of them are clearly not even close to passing, others are kind of almost passing or almost getting a C-, but not quite. Let's look at some A-level thesis statements. So I'm going to start with this one right here. In his article, Body Rituals Among the Nasarema, that's just American spelled backwards, Miner effectively convinces his reader of the ridiculous nature of America's obsession with the body's health and visual appeal by allowing his readers to form a third-party opinion of themselves before realizing they are their own subject. Miner achieves this by employing an academic tone, detached diction, and superior common ground to place his reader on the level of a scholar observing a native tribe. So first of all, this was written by a professional, so this is obviously an A-level thesis. It's doing several things right. So number one, it includes the name of the text. In your case, it'll be an image or the company that produced the image or the brand or the product, and the name of the rhetorician. In this case, it's Miner. It also includes the how, the why, and the so what. So not only does it tell me what this piece is arguing, it tells me how the piece is arguing by giving me some examples that are then going to be explored throughout the text of the essay. Notice when you look at this thesis, not only is it long, which does not necessarily mean that a thesis is good or bad, the length, but notice that there are words like by and in order to. Those are words that force the writer to be analytical. So if you find yourself using words like because, since, or by, that is a good sign. It means you're providing some analysis. You're not just telling me what the ad or what the image is arguing. You're telling me how it's arguing it. And notice also that the how is not something incredibly obvious. You can see that the piece that's being analyzed here is obviously a really interesting one. It sounds like it's a parody. So the writer has chosen a really interesting piece to analyze. But hopefully you've also chosen a compelling or problematic or fascinating ad to unpack. So you want to make sure your thesis is answering how and why and so what questions, just like this one is doing. Here's an example of a student thesis statement. This is in the B+ or A- zone for sure. Therefore, the creators of this image assume that people actually say these things to others in public. Ethos is used in their goal to raise awareness about the fact that racial microaggressions are common. Pathos is captured since they are demeaning and hurtful to a person, and logos is expressed through the use of deductive reasoning as the audience learns that these transgressions can create a negative impact to individuals on the receiving end. There's a lot I like about this thesis. It's never a bad thing to include words like therefore or thus or in order to or because in your thesis statement. So that's a good thing. Even though this thesis statement does not mention the name of the text or the image that they're analyzing, I'm assuming that the writer earlier in the introduction, maybe right before the thesis, introduced the image and included who created the image and a little bit of context. So we're assuming that the writer did that earlier in the introduction. I like how the writer is including what's on the prompt. The prompt is asking you to think about ethos, logos, and pathos. It's asking you to think about how the ad is using those rhetorical appeals. So I like that the writer includes those. Now, you do not have to do that, right? Somewhere in your essay, you have to mention the rhetorical appeals, but you don't have to do that in your thesis. You don't have to divide your essay according to the rhetorical appeals. That's just one strategy. So it includes not just that the ad is using rhetorical appeals, but how the ad is using the rhetorical appeals. I also like that there's a mention of deductive reasoning, since that's one of the things we've talked about earlier in the semester. Now, there are a few things this person could polish, right? It's not a perfect thesis yet, but it's pretty good. I would avoid the use of passive voice like is used. That's a minor thing, but that would polish up the thesis. Some of the wording is a little bit awkward in places, like hurtful to a person seems a little bit redundant. But overall, in terms of the quality of the argument, it's pretty effective. Let's look at one more passing thesis down at the bottom here. The photograph effectively invites contemporary viewers to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between humans and the environment. In particular, the photographer's use of scale, contrast, and composition work together seamlessly to disrupt viewers' expectations, thereby providing an alternative perspective on the current state of our natural resources. So ideally, when the reader reads your essay, they think, wow, I didn't know an image could be doing so much, right? That's the impression you want to leave your reader with when they're reading your rhetorical analysis. And again, in this example, we're assuming that the writer has introduced the photograph, maybe described it a little bit, included when it was printed or where it was published, who the photographer is earlier in the introduction, if they didn't do so in the thesis. So it's telling the reader a little bit about the audience, how the photographer is conveying this argument to the audience, and also why the photographer is conveying this message to the audience. So there's what, there's how, and there's why. This is a really effective A thesis for sure. Let's look at some examples of thesis statements that are not passing, that people need to keep trying, which, by the way, is not a bad thing at first. Your thesis statement should be something that you're constantly coming back to and tinkering with. That's why we call it a tentative thesis statement. Then it turns into a rough thesis statement. Then finally, at the very end of the writing process, once you've polished the thesis statement, you're ready to submit your essay. But it's a constant process. You're constantly going back to your thesis, tinkering with that statement itself, and making sure that all of your examples are proving your thesis statement and nothing but your thesis. Let's look at the first one. The advertisement for Elizabeth Warren uses ethos, pathos, and logos to convince the audience. So I like the fact that this writer included what the ad is, or what the ad is endorsing, in this case Elizabeth Warren, but it just lists these 3 rhetorical appeals, and it says something that's actually pretty obvious, right? When people use these rhetorical appeals, they're trying to convince an audience of something or persuade an audience of something. So if I could take this thesis and substitute any image, any ad, or any text and have the thesis still make sense, that actually means the thesis is not specific and precise enough. So I could just as easily say something like the advertisement for Pantene Pro V shampoo uses these rhetorical appeals to convince the audience, or the advertisement for Donald Trump uses these appeals. I could kind of say that about anything. That's not a good thing when you're writing a thesis. It means your argument is too kind of vague, not really precise, and not very analytical. Let's look at another one that's not passing. This pro-Trump meme argues that Trump should be reelected because he will keep Americans safe. So I like the fact that the person includes the main argument of the meme, but this is a rhetorical analysis, not a summary of what the ad is saying, but an analysis of how the ad is saying it, what strategies the rhetorician or the advertiser is using. So this is just telling me what the ad is arguing, which is probably pretty obvious, right? We're trying to go beyond the obvious. We're trying to pull out these specific rhetorical devices and tools and techniques that the rhetorician is using. So even though I couldn't plug in any advertisement into this thesis and have it make sense, it's still not very specific, and it's not getting to the how or why or so what. Another one. In the advertisement created by Trump's super PAC, the rhetoricians use several approaches to convince millennials to vote for him, but voting for Trump is a big mistake. So this one is better, right? It's doing a little bit better, but it's still not quite passing. Let's talk about why. So I like the fact that this writer is including the ad and who created it. I like the fact that this writer is including that term rhetorician and mentioning that the ad is using several different approaches. I also like that they're pulling out a specific audience, right? That they're saying the audience is not just any voter, it's millennial voters. So that's good. Those are all good things. But it's not getting to the how or the why. And also it includes personal opinion, not on the ad, but on what the ad is endorsing. So for a rhetorical analysis essay, we are not agreeing or disagreeing with the message or the product being sold. There's a time and a place to do that in this class, absolutely, but this essay is not the time to do that. We're talking about the effectiveness of the ad. To what extent is the ad effective? What devices is it using? How is it using those rhetorical appeals? So the last part of that, while interesting, does not belong in a rhetorical analysis essay. And once we take that out, we're not left with a whole lot. Let's look at one more. Although the Pantene Pro-V advertisement is appealing, the audience should not be fooled because the product does not make your hair shiny and it's very expensive. So like the previous ad or the previous thesis statement, this one makes a judgment about the product itself, not how effectively the ad is conveying the message, but just the product itself. Right? It kind of just seems like this person has a bone to pick with Pantene Pro-V shampoo. Doesn't belong in a rhetorical analysis essay. We're not focusing on the product or the candidate. We're focusing on how effectively the rhetorician is conveying that message. I do like that the person begins with an although clause. Never a bad idea to begin a thesis with an although clause or to address the other point of view or to add some complexity to your thesis statement. But ultimately what we're left with is that the advertisement is kind of appealing, but the product isn't very good. That's not going to be appropriate for a rhetorical analysis essay. It's not going to work. So just because these thesis statements are non-passing doesn't mean that they can't be improved. All of these ads sound fascinating. All of these ads sound like they'd be really interesting for a rhetorical analysis essay. The most important thing, though, is to include the how, the why, the so what. Also, go back to the essay prompt to look at what specific questions I'm asking you to cover in your essay.